So hi everyone, my name is Adrienne Brodie. I am the data librarian based on the Mesa campus. I am also the liaison librarian to several ASHES programs and SOMA. So today we're going to talk about research data management. I'll have time for questions periodically, so let's just try to save questions to the end. So data can mean many things to different people. Researchers also may think of diaries, photographs, survey results, field notes, or spreadsheets. And administrators may think of enrollment data or graduation rates. Others may think of data collected by a government agency or it being part of their phone plan. But a good definition of data is it is the output from any systematic investigation involving a process of observation, experiment, or the testing of a hypothesis, which when assembled in context and interpreted expertly will produce new knowledge. So that is a lot of information and it can be overwhelming. It can come in the form of documents, spreadsheets, questionnaires, audio, images, and many other formats. So how do we keep it organized and how do we keep it useful? Why bother with managing data? So question for the audience, what do you think when you hear data management? And just post those answers in the chat. Does anyone have any thoughts of what data management might mean? Let's see, organizing information for easy retrieval, standardizing the organization. That's a great definition, Anne, thank you. Anyone else? Data management is something you don't do, it's an IT thing. Well, everyone does have the skills to do data management. It may not be on a large scale, but we'll learn some best practices today. Just things to keep in mind to help you stay organized and help you find everything. So my definition of data management is basically an organized method for storing and preserving data, including a way to share the data with other researchers to reuse, and reuse is based on author permissions. But here's a more robust definition here on the slide. So my goals for this presentation today are just inform you about the current requirements that mandate data management and data management plans from federal funders, journals, publishers, etc. Also learn and apply best practices for data throughout the research lifecycle, and then also learn about support options available from the A.T. Still Memorial Library. So let's begin with goal 1, which is data management requirements. There are official rules or mandates from federal funders. Even if there are no funder requirements, there are individual journals or publishers that require data to be shared, the data that's behind the tables, the figures, and conclusions in a research article be made available either in the appendix or in a repository. There are other policies that require materials and protocols be made available to readers. So one example of a strictly enforced data policy from the National Institute of Health is the genomic data sharing policy. This policy applies to a large scale genomic data like GWAS, genomic sequence and gene expression data. Requirements for this include writing genomic data sharing plan when applying for funding, sharing the data no later than the date of publication. The National Science Foundation began requiring data management plans with the majority of their grants in 2011, and each division of the National Science Foundation was allowed to write its own guidelines. This allowed for discipline-specific elements to be included in the plan, but complicated it for researchers. And then the newest requirement is now through the National Institute of Health. So they have a slow evolution of requiring a data management plan with their grants. In 2003, they released a data sharing policy requiring all grants over 500,000 per year or more to be submitted with a data sharing plan. However, there were no mechanisms in place to enforce this policy, meaning there are no repercussions for failing to comply. And they also had very sparse details in terms of what was required within the plan, making compliance spotty. In 2015, they released a white paper stating an upcoming data management plan requirements and began a work group to determine how to implement those requirements. But they realized in November of 2016 that it's going to require a lot of help. They had a number of public comments for this, and then they realized that there are greater challenges than anticipated. In 2018, they finally debuted their strategic plan for data science. It provided a roadmap for modernizing the NIH-funded biomedical data science ecosystems. Topics included storing, managing, standardizing, and publishing biomedical research data. Comments were collected and feedback was obtained from the public in order to inform the development of a draft NIH policy for data management and sharing, which was released for additional public comment until its development. The current requirements, the plan was finally released in October of last year. However, the effective date doesn't until January of 2023. And I just wanted to highlight some of the key elements that will need to be included within the data management plan. So you need to speak about the data, what is it, what does it contain? If any tools, software, or code are needed to access or manipulate the data, any indication of standards that are going to be applied to the data and associated metadata, plans and timelines for data preservation and access, distribution, or reuse considerations. So any privacy things, how were human subjects informed about consent, controlling data, access, things like that, and then oversight of data management and sharing. So, who on the team is going to be responsible for making sure access is still around after the research project is completed. And for more details, you can see it in the supplemental information about the elements of the NIH data management and sharing plan. So that's just some highlights of federal funders. There are other funding agencies. So it really just depends on who you're working with to learn those ahead of time, so you don't begin the process and realize you need to go back and write a data management plan. I'm not going to read every requirement, but these are just some highlights of different journals that do require data sharing. There is a good overview on who requires data sharing on the data services guide listed under data sharing. There's also more details about different funder requirements. Generally, data sharing policies for individual journals are found under the author guidelines or submission guidelines. So those can be checked in addition to learn about their peer review process, if they have open access policies, things like that. And they will outline how they want you to provide access to the raw data. So data sharing methods that are common are to use a repository like Open Science, Dryad, or discipline-specific repository. You can also choose self-storage, especially for smaller data sets. And then you can have it that individuals need to contact the author for that data set. However, if you choose this method, make sure you have clearly labeled data columns and a data dictionary, and please only one data point per column. The last thing you want are questions about what is in this column and you have no idea because the project ended years ago. Other mistakes that you want to avoid if you choose to have the contact the author is make sure you can find it. Don't lose it, especially on the first request. Be aware of bit rot, so just keeping it on a USB stick or a CD, you may lose access. Make sure you have more than one copy. Only having one copy is not a good idea. It can become corrupt and then you don't have access to it anymore. You want to avoid file formats that can only be read by a specific program, especially if that program is no longer in use. I've already mentioned, you want to make sure field names are labeled correctly and are easy to understand by outsiders who weren't involved in the research project. And then you also want to make sure you have updated contact information to the co-authors, so that way if you do have questions, you can either point people to your co-authors or you can reach out to them directly to answer the person's question. And then, as I mentioned, there are some publishers that also require data sharing. The one I want to mention here and highlight is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So there's a number of journals that fall under this. Some examples are Academic Medicine, British Journal of Occupational Therapy, the JAOA, Journal of Dental Education, JADA, JAMA, Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, Seminars and Hearing. So they all follow that there needs to be data sharing. Individual data can be de-identified, but you should include this in the data dictionary. You need to have a plan on how you're going to share it, provide access to additional related documents when needed, like the study protocol, statistical analysis plan, etc. You need to have an idea of when the data will be available and for how long, and what access criteria you'll need. So who can request it, for what purpose, and by what mechanism. And then here's just a nice table of things you can think about and different examples of sharing. So before I move to the next topic, you just have a general idea of that there are requirements for you to have a data management plan. It helps science, it helps develop open science. You're allowing other researchers to reuse your data to reanalyze and answer other research questions. You may think, if I don't do this, whatever, who's going to care? But there are repercussions for failing to follow having a data management plan. Besides repercussions from the funders, there's also article retractions. So here are 4 examples of when articles were retracted and for their reasons. So the first one was a former NIU researcher who falsified data in 3 papers and 7 grants. There was also a instance, you can see here, the data went missing, so they just filled in the gaps. They just made it up. There's another instance when the journal pulled the paper because the data was missing. And then there was a New England Journal of Medicine paper on sleep apnea that was retracted when the original data couldn't be found. So as I mentioned, you want to make sure you can find it. You can still open it. You understand what it still means when people ask for it. So you do want to avoid retractions, and here are just 2 research studies explaining why to avoid reactions. So the current biology study, found that at least one apparently working email for 300 85 papers, about 70% of them either in the article itself or by searching online. When they reached out, they received 101 data sets, only 19%. They were told by another 24% that the data was still in use and could not be shared. 121 data sets were only confirmed that they were still in existence. The odds ratio suggests that for every yearly increase in article age, the odds of data set existing decreased by 17%. The major cause of the reduced data availability for older papers was that rapid increase in the proportion of data sets reported as either lost or inaccessible due to storage. A stolen computer, it's located in a parent's attic, it was on a floppy disk, and it can't be used anymore. And then the study in the Bulletin of Medical Library Association examined 235 retracted articles. These articles were cited a total of 2,034 times over after retraction. So their findings were that 190 of the 235 were retracted by the authors, 45 were retracted by others, such as investigating committees or deans, editors, legal counsel. 91 or 38% were retracted due to error. 86 or 36% were retracted due to misconduct. 36 or 16% could not be replicated, and 20 or about 8% were for other reasons. It's important to note this because even if the retraction is clearly labeled, it does not ensure that all subsequent researchers will be alerted to the retraction and will cease making references to the retracted work. So now we're going to move on to best practices, and we're going to cover different aspects of the data lifecycle. I'll intersperse library support throughout so you understand how you can get help for these different requirements and why are librarians fit to assist with this. We are authoritative curators of information. We already assist with other aspects of research. We have interdisciplinary communication skills, and we have specialized knowledge of information organization. So the biggest one is the planning phase in the very beginning, the data management plan. While researchers may just want to do the research, there are many benefits to having a clear plan laid out. It will save you countless hours of work later in the process if a clear plan is laid out ahead of time. As more funders, journals, and institutional mandates are requiring a plan, learning the best practices will set you up for success. So some benefits of having a plan ahead of time allow you to have consistent data collecting standards followed by all researchers involved in the project. You increase efficiency of research with clearly identified roles for managing and collecting data. You adhere to different requirements. It allows for easy sharing and reanalyzing of data by other researchers. Proper record management and metadata development allows others to make sense of your data, and storing and preservation will allow you to quickly locate the raw data if a question pops up or something needs to be reanalyzed. We do have a data services guide with a number of resources for creating a data management plan. We also have listed some best practices, a good checklist with questions to ask yourself for each of the key elements. So librarian support offered for the writing of a data management plan is rating, offering guidance on data management plan requirements from funders or journals, and then also recommendations and tools and resources for creating those data management plans. So after you plan, you move on to the collection. So within the plan, you should have clearly defined roles of the team members. You should have an idea of how you're collecting the data, what standards or methodologies you will use. It's a good idea to have a data dictionary ahead of time. So a data dictionary helps you determine what data is collected, how it's formatted, what units of measures will be used. Are you going to put the date, month, day, year? Are you gonna flip it? Are you only having a yes, no column? Are you having, are you using milliliters or liters? All that sort of stuff. It needs to be standardized ahead of time. So that way, when you go to analyze it and make visualizations, everything's the same. You don't have to worry about thinking about that. You also need to think about null values. How are you going to record those? Do you leave it blank? Do you put in null? Especially if there's multiple data entry people, you need to make sure everyone enters the data the same, and that's why a data dictionary is extremely helpful. You also want to ensure that raw data is preserved without processing. And please note, 1 data point per column. You don't want to do age and sex of a participant in 1 column. You want to split those out. Everyone's ages, everyone's sex, 2 different columns, so that way you don't have to do it later on, especially if you have a very large data set. If you aren't collecting the data, then you also have the option to reuse data sets from other researchers, and you can use those to reanalyze in statistical software or just make visualizations to help get an idea. However, just keep in mind that if you do reuse data, that they do require a citation just like any other reference used for research. Library support for this is we can help you locate a data set, but I will mention that it is a timely process and there may not be a data set that perfectly matches. There are a number of sources that you can use to locate a data set. You go to the data services guide, there's a number of sources there. You can also look through research articles and there are associated data filters, especially within PubMed, that you can use to limit your results to getting the associated data set. There are a number of data repositories. There's a repository of data repositories that you can search through. And then Google also has a nice data set search tool, sort of like Google Scholar, that help you kind of find things as well. We can also assist with creating the data dictionary, and we can also recommend tools for data cleanup. So my next topic is metadata, and who doesn't love metadata? It is the describe component of the data cycle. It is basically data about data. It is used within the documentation part that describes, your data. So there's 3 different types, which I've listed here. There's descriptive, structural, and administrative, and then I give you some examples of what each type could mean. There's also a variety of standards and schemas with very detailed documentation on how to use that metadata. The important aspect of metadata is making sure your research is discoverable with proper keywords using a controlled vocabulary. So you can use a taxonomy, thesaurus, or oncology. The taxonomy is a controlled vocabulary that is arranged in a hierarchy. Terms are not usually defined and relationships between terms are not defined. A thesaurus is a taxonomy that contains additional information about the use of terms, for example, mesh. And an ontology is a controlled vocabulary that defines the terms in a given domain or knowledge base and the relationships between those terms. An example is SNOMED. So a librarian is extremely helpful within creating metadata. We do it all the time for other different resources. So we are able to assist with creating metadata. We can guide with what standard to use for metadata creation. We can also review created metadata to make sure it's descriptive and increase discoverability. And then we can also help you map to proper terms, for example, using mesh. So documentation is your way of explaining procedures and your project to other people. It must be clear to people both inside and outside your research group. There should also be explanations of terms to explain the research for people outside of the field. So good documentation is essential for providing quality data for analysis. It assists when there are transitions in the personnel of the project. It is a backup to researchers if there are any allegations of misconduct. It ensures sources are credited. It acts as a record to show that work appearing later in articles was actually done in the way described, and it makes sharing data easier by explaining everything a researcher might need to know. Along with good documentation, file naming should also follow a scheme. File names should be consistent, descriptive, brief, use underscores instead of spaces to separate words and dates, stick to letters and numbers, avoid special characters, and include a version number. File structure and organization helps to find information quickly. It should make sense for all team members. Some options for file organization is having a separate folder for each project or each data type, separate folders for each day if you're collecting a lot of raw data, all data in one location with regular backups, store on one type of media, and files should be in consistent formats when possible. Data variables should be explained in the documentation. It should include the name of the variable, its description, what type of data it is, such as a date or integer, what the units of measurement are, and if there are restrictions, a restricted set of possible values, and what those values would be. It's also helpful if the names chosen for the variables are as intuitive and meaningful as possible to avoid confusion. Documentation of workflows is just as important as documentation of variables and file naming conventions. The meaning of data depends on the content of how it was collected. It also prevents items from falling through the cracks. So you can ask yourself how, when, and who will do the work. Will data be reviewed for quality? Who manages the entire process? And metadata we already covered. So librarian support is to assist with creating file naming conventions or directory. How are you going to organize it? Assist with creating a file versioning schedule, and then also make recommendations on choosing appropriate file formats for preservation and sharing data. So there are benefits to sharing data. I know a lot of people think, it's for me, do your own work. But the benefits include to increase your visibility by including data in open access repositories, raise your prominence by contributing to the field and keep your research relevant, facilitate new discoveries by allowing other researchers to use your data sets. Data sets can be reanalyzed to answer a research question and prevent duplication of effort, meet funding requirements, which we've already mentioned, and make public assets available to the public through publishing data papers, research articles with your conclusions, and submitting data sets to open repositories. Of course, not all data can be shared, and those are listed there. Data involving threatened or endangered species, security, export controls related to technology, personal health information, and data involving children or prisoners. So some best practices when you do decide to share data, there are many, but there are just a few I want to highlight. You want to use open source file formats. You want to have a consistent file format. You want to select files that can be edited regardless of application. You want to upload data sets to open repositories for easy access, and you want to keep it clean by avoiding missing values or unclear column headers. So the library can support you in a number of ways. We can help you create a DOI, persistent ID, measure citation impact, provide guidance on different requirements for sharing data from funders or journals, help you actually locate a data repository to add, and then also help you understand what the data repository, like access controls you can set up, things like that. If you do want to decide to do a data paper, we can help with creating that. Ensure data meets fair data principles, and also help you locate a data journal to submit that second publication of a research project. So as you go through, you're collecting your data, you're keeping it organized, you have a system all set up. You're going to need to store all this information somewhere. Best practices for storing involve making 3 copies. You have the original copy, and an external copy, an original copy, and local, and then an external copy and a remote. You want to create a schedule for backing up the data. How often are you going to do this? Are you doing it once a week, once a month? Depends on how large your data set is and how frequently you're collecting it. You want to make sure you have an assigned person for data maintenance. You can't just assume, oh, so-and-so is going to take care of it. You need to make sure someone is responsible for this. You want to make sure you transfer the data to a newer technology to avoid bit rot. So, floppy disks are no longer used. You don't want to just keep it on a floppy disk. USB sticks can go to bit rot, same with CDs. So you want to make sure you move it along. And you want to make sure it's unencrypted, so it's easily read by you and others in the future. Some university options we have are our H drive or Google Suite, and then there's also cloud storage options such as Amazon, Elephant Drive, and Dropbox. After you store it, you also want to preserve it. So there will be retention requirements from funders. Basically, how long should it be kept after a particular award has been completed? There'll also be repository requirements, and I'll also let you know how long it'll be accessible for. When you do choose a repository, there's a number of things to keep in mind. You want a well-regarded one to make sure it's reliable and stable. You want to make sure it's well adopted by other researchers in your discipline. You want to make sure you review the policies on access, rights, and licensing. See if there's any repository benefits, like does it create a DOI or a persistent identifier for you? Is it indexed by major search engines? So can people find it via Google? Does it provide any download metrics? And are there any costs for storage? The library can support you for both storage and preservation. I've already mentioned we can help you locate a data repository, offer best guidance on storage and backup, help you upload the data sets to a repository, and then interpret funder or publisher repository requirements. So privacy and security. The image here is the CC license, the Creative Commons license, which is basically an open access license. And it lets people know what they can and can't do with your information. So a license states what can be done with the data and how the data can be redistributed. The open license facilitates data sharing while increasing the visibility of your data and advancing knowledge. Waivers relinquish all rights of ownership or control and usually commit the work to the public domain. You can use a variety of Creative Commons license to notify others of what they can and can't do. And you also want to make sure there are security measures in place to prevent information leaks. So that's through access control by providing different permission levels to individuals, have an audit log of data use authentication via strong passwords. Unique identifiers, data, and keys should be placed in separate password protected files. Use data secure data transmission like the SSL certificate, limit personal browsing on machines with sensitive information, and avoid storing sensitive information on mobile devices. And then, of course, everyone is familiar with HIPAA, of protecting the health information of others. So library support for privacy and security, the main thing will be helping you determine what CC license to select, help you discover who owns your data, guidance and recommendations on what to keep private and how to keep private, and also guidance on security best practices. As I've gone through this, I've mentioned multiple times how the library is here to support you with data. However, we do have other research departments you should be aware of. We have the Department of Research Support. We have the IRB sponsored programs to help with grants, and the AT Still Research Institute. Here are some useful resources. So the Library Research Hub has a number of resources and information about the research process besides data. We have our data services guide, which covers everything that I've mentioned in this presentation, plus in much more detail. And then there's also the Retraction Watch blog, which is interesting because you can see when articles are being retracted and for what reason. Plus, always be on the lookout for library announcements on data and research support available to faculty and staff. To get started, you want to contact your liaison librarian so you can see, based on your program, who you should contact. Of course, if you contact any of us, we're all happy to help, so don't hesitate to reach out. So now I'll open it up for questions. Are there any questions about anything we covered today? No, it's a lot of information. Okay, I don't see any questions. So just here are all the references I used for the information in this project, our presentation. And I want to stop share. So I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today. And if you do think of any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the library. We are here to support you.